Vlog effects used by YouTubers.
Nice.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
Damn! Why are you running? Why are you running?
Yesterday, meanwhile, back in the lowlands, a few moments later, more moments later, later. What follows is a brief construction montage. Later, in the void. A little later, much later, much later, much later, much later, the following Thursday, later that same evening. Just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m., 8:01 p.m., 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later,
1 hour later!
1 hour later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 2 hours 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 later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later, approximately 10 hours later, several song-filled hours later, many hours later, many unbearable hours later, tomorrow for sure, 24 hours later, 24 hours later, early the next morning, 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 the next day, the next day, the next day, the following day, tomorrow, the very next evening, day 2, 48 hours later, 2 days later, day 3, 72 hours later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, day 4,